History is full of rulers who chased power, wealth, and immortality. But few stories are as unsettling as the queen who is said to sleep in blood to preserve her youth. This was not simply vanity. It was a dangerous obsession with eternal beauty, and it turned her into one of the darkest figures in European history. Her name was Elizabeth, a Hungarian noblewoman born in 1560. On the surface, she was everything society admired. She came from one of the most powerful families in Central Europe, connected to kings, princes, and the ruling elite. She was intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and managed vast estates. To outsiders, she looked like the perfect example of royal grace. But behind the castle walls, rumors began to spread. Servants whispered about girls who entered her chambers, but never returned. And soon, a legend was born that the Countess believed the secret to eternal youth was hidden in the blood of the young. Why blood? In the 16th and 17th centuries, medicine was primitive and mixed with superstition. Alchemists, healers, and even physicians often claimed that human blood held special powers. Some believed it could cure illness. Others thought it could restore lost strength. These old beliefs merged with her growing fear of aging. When a servant girl once accidentally pulled her hair while dressing her, the Countess struck the girl so hard that blood splattered onto her skin. Looking in the mirror afterward, convinced herself that her flesh appeared smoother where the blood had touched. That single moment planted the seed of her terrifying ritual. Soon her practices escalated. Young servant girls from nearby villages were lured into the castle with promises of work. Some went willingly, desperate for income. Others were taken by force. Once inside, they were rarely seen again. Witnesses later described how drained their blood, using it in baths or smearing it on her body before sleep. She was convinced this ritual would preserve her youth forever. But while legends painted her as a vampire queen, the truth was even darker. It was not just about vanity. It was about control, cruelty, and the unchecked power of a noblewoman whose status placed her above the law. For years, she continued these rituals in secret, protected by her wealth and influence. Local authorities feared challenging her, and the peasants were too terrified to speak out. Yet whispers cannot be silenced forever. As more and more girls disappeared, the stories grew louder. Parents began warning their daughters never to go near the castle. Priests started preaching about the devil's work. By the early 1600s, even the king himself could no longer ignore the accusations. What they discovered inside the walls of S Castle would shock Europe forever, brand her as one of history's most notorious women. But was she truly guilty of bathing in blood? Or was her story twisted by political rivals who wanted her power destroyed? The answer lies buried in the disturbing evidence that followed. By the early 1600s, the castle of Elizabeth was no longer just a symbol of noble prestige. To the peasants living nearby, it was a place of fear. Villagers whispered of carts carrying away lifeless bodies under the cover of night. Rumors spread of screams echoing through stone corridors. The Countess's name became associated with something darker than nobility, something closer to witchcraft and evil. At first, authorities ignored the complaints. In feudal Hungary, nobles had extraordinary power. A peasant's word carried little weight against a woman whose family was tied to kings. Elizabeth was married to Count Ferenc, a powerful soldier who fought the Ottomans. His reputation as the Black Knight of Hungary gave their household even more untouchable status. As long as her husband lived, no one dared to question her. But after Ferenc's death in 1604, S' behavior reportedly grew bolder. Without his military presence protecting her, she became the undisputed master of her estates. Servant girls continued to vanish. Neighbors whispered that she experimented with torture burning, freezing, and even biting her victims. While the infamous claim of bathing in blood may have been exaggerated, testimonies suggested that she did believe blood had magical restorative powers. The rumors grew so persistent that they reached King Matthias II of Hungary. At first, even he hesitated. His family connections were too powerful to attack lightly. But the disappearances were becoming impossible to ignore. Pressure mounted from both the church and the nobility. Eventually, the king ordered an investigation, led by a trusted nobleman, Georgi, who was both a relative and a political rival of the Countess. As investigation began quietly, Witnesses were summoned, testimonies were recorded. Servants, villagers, and priests spoke of girls who entered the castle but never left. Some claimed they saw bodies buried near the walls. Others said they witnessed young women covered in wounds, barely alive, trying to escape. Over 300 statements were collected, painting a horrific picture of life inside the Countess's household. Still, doubt remained. Much of this was truth, and how much was rumor magnified by fear? In 17th-century Europe, accusations of witchcraft and cruelty were often used as political weapons. Powerful women, especially widows, were easy targets. Yet the sheer number of testimonies against was overwhelming, and soon would no longer rely on words alone. In December 1610, he led soldiers directly to her castle to confront her. What they found inside was so shocking that it spread across Europe like wildfire. According to reports, several dead and dying girls were discovered within the walls. Some were mutilated, others chained, and a few still clung to life but were too weak to stand. The Queen's darkest secret had been exposed, or so it seemed. But even after this dramatic discovery, questions lingered. Were these truly her victims, or were the findings exaggerated to destroy her? And if she was guilty, why had she been allowed to continue for so long without punishment? The trial that followed would attempt to answer these questions, but it would also raise new ones about justice, power, and the terrifying lengths to which rulers could go in pursuit of vanity. The arrest of Elizabeth in December 1610 sent shockwaves through Hungary and beyond. Soldiers dragged her from her chambers as they uncovered what they claimed were fresh corpses and half-dead victims hidden in the castle. Word spread quickly. The Blood Countess had been caught in the act. But bringing such a powerful noblewoman to justice was no simple matter. Elizabeth was not just any aristocrat. She was related to the most influential families in the kingdom. If she were put on trial like a common criminal, the scandal could destabilize Hungary's fragile political balance. Instead, her servants became the first to face interrogation. Dozens of testimonies were recorded under oath. Some servants confessed to aiding in the torture of girls, though historians suspect many spoke under duress. They described nightmarish scenes. Girls beaten until their flesh tore, burned with hot irons, or left to freeze outside in winter. One servant claimed that Elizabeth bit chunks of flesh from victims, a detail that blurred the line between fact and myth. Another insisted that she drained their blood and smeared it on her skin, convinced it preserved her beauty. The most shocking number to emerge from these testimonies was staggering over 600 victims. This figure has haunted history books ever since. But was it accurate? Some scholars believe it was wildly inflated, designed to amplify her legend as a monster. Others argue that while the number may have been exaggerated, the scale of cruelty was undeniable. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried. To protect her noble bloodline, authorities avoided placing her in a public courtroom. Instead, her accomplices bore the brunt of justice. Many were executed after gruesome trials in 1611. They were burned, mutilated, or decapitated for their role in the killings. Elizabeth, however, was spared execution. Her punishment was imprisonment within her own castle, a fate that kept her alive but erased her from public life. She was confined to a small bricked-off room inside Lactus Castle, with only narrow slits for food and air. No visitors, no freedom, no more victims, at least officially. For the next 4 years, she wasted away in isolation, until her death in 1614. Yet the mystery remains. Was she truly guilty of the crimes attributed to her? Or was she the victim of a carefully orchestrated plot? Her enormous wealth made her a tempting target for political rivals. Confiscating her estates benefited the crown and weakened her family. The accusations, no matter how horrifying, conveniently removed a powerful widow from Hungary's political stage. Even centuries later, historians remain divided. Some see her as one of history's worst female serial killers, while others view her as a scapegoat whose story was twisted into a Gothic legend. What is clear is that her name, Elizabeth, has become forever linked to the image of a queen who bathed in blood to stay young. But what if the blood rituals were exaggerated or even invented? Where did the legend of the vampire queen truly begin? Why has it endured for so long? When Elizabeth died in 1614, her body was quietly buried, and her name should have faded into obscurity. But instead, her story began to grow larger than life. Over time, she transformed from a disgraced noblewoman into one of Europe. A starkest legends, a figure so terrifying that her name still echoes in popular culture. The accusations of blood rituals were not forgotten. In fact, they became more sensational with each retelling. Peasants whispered that she bathed in the blood of virgins, not just smeared it on her skin. Others claimed she drank it as if it were wine, believing it gave her eternal youth. The truth was blurred, and myth took over. In 18th and 19th century Europe, when Gothic horror was becoming popular, writers rediscovered her story. They were fascinated by her cruelty, her noble status, and the eerie connection between blood and immortality. She was no longer just a cruel noblewoman, she became the Blood Countess, a woman who murdered hundreds of virgins to keep her beauty. This legend placed her alongside vampire myths that were spreading across Europe at the time. In fact, many believe that directly influenced the creation of vampire literature, including Bram Stoker's Dracula. While Stoker's count was based primarily on Vlad the Impaler, the obsession with blood and eternal life also reflected the chilling rumors about Elizabeth. The fascination with her story reveals something deeper about human fear. Across cultures, blood has always been associated with life, death, and purity. To twist it into a tool of vanity and cruelty created one of the most horrifying images imaginably. Queen lying in a bed soaked with blood, believing it would erase her wrinkles. But this transformation into legend raises an important question. How much of what we know about her is based on fact, and how much was invention? The surviving documents from her trial and imprisonment describe torture and murder. But the specific details about bathing in blood appear years later, added by storytellers who wanted to shock their audiences. Historians now suggest that Elizabeth may have been guilty of terrible crimes, but not in the fantastical way later described. She might have abused and killed servants, but the bloody rituals were likely exaggerations. They served a purpose: to turn her into a monstrous figure that justified her downfall and erased her political influence. And yet, the legend endured because it spoke to timeless fears, the fear of aging, the corruption of power, and the lengths people will go to cling to youth. Her story was not just history anymore. It was a warning, a myth, and a nightmare rolled into one. But the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. If the blood bathing was a myth, then why did so many people believe it? Who spread these stories, and what did they stand to gain? The answer lies not just in her crimes, but in the political, religious, and cultural tensions of the era. To understand how Elizabeth became the infamous Blood Countess, we must look beyond the castle walls. Her story was not shaped by her actions alone, but by the political games and cultural fears of her time. In the early 17th century, Hungary was in crisis. The kingdom was caught between three competing powers: the Habsburg Empire in the west, the Ottoman Turks in the south, and its own noble families, who fought fiercely to maintain their independence. Within this chaos, Elizabeth's family, though, was one of the most powerful. It controlled vast lands, wealth, and influence. Some members even sat on thrones of Transylvania and Poland. This made Elizabeth not just a wealthy widow, but also a dangerous rival. If she continued to hold power, her family's dominance could threaten both the Hungarian king and the Habsburg rulers. Stripping her of wealth and land would weaken the name and strengthen the crown. Her alleged crimes provided the perfect excuse. Religion also played a role. Elizabeth was a Protestant in a kingdom where Catholicism was growing stronger under the influence of the Habsburgs. In an era when faith defined politics, her Protestant ties made her an even easier target. Branding her as a servant of evil, accused of demonic rituals and blood sacrifices, gave the Catholic leadership a moral weapon against her family. Then there was the cultural fear of powerful women. In early modern Europe, widows who controlled wealth and land were viewed with suspicion. They were independent in ways that society found threatening. Tales of witches, sorceresses, and cruel noblewomen were often used to demonize women who stepped outside traditional roles. Elizabeth's legend fits neatly into this pattern. Her gender and power made her an easy subject for exaggeration. This is why her story grew into something larger than the documented crimes. It was no longer just about mistreated. Servantship became a tale of a woman possessed by vanity, sorcery, and evil. The blood rituals, whether true or not, symbolized the corruption of a woman who dared to hold too much power. It is important to remember that the most grotesque details about her bathing in blood appear not in the original trial documents, but in later writings. By then, her reputation was already destroyed. turning her into a mythical monster, served everyone's purpose: political rivals, religious leaders, and even ordinary people hungry for shocking tales. In this way, Elizabeth was both a criminal and a creation. She may have tortured and killed servants, but the image of her as a vampire queen was built by a society eager to punish her family, condemn her faith, and warn against women who held power. But the question remains, how did this transformation from history into legend spread so far beyond Hungary? The answer lies in Europe's obsession with blood, witchcraft, and the supernatural land obsession that was reaching its peak in the very years after her death. When Elizabeth's story spread across Europe, it did not travel as a simple tale of cruelty. Instead, it became entangled with one of the most powerful cultural fears of the 16th and 17th centuries: witchcraft. This was the era of the witch hunts. Across Europe, tens of thousands of women, mostly poor and powerless, were accused of making pacts with the devil, casting spells, or committing unspeakable rituals. Fire consumed villages, courts swarmed with accusations, and fear shaped daily life. It was not enough to be guilty of a crime; you could be guilty of evil simply by reputation. Elizabeth's case fit perfectly into this atmosphere. She was accused not just of murder, but of using blood in rituals. Blood, in Christian symbolism, was sacred. The blood of Christ represented salvation. To use blood in a twisted way was seen as the ultimate act of blasphemy. Her alleged baths in the blood of virgins were more than grotesque; they suggested demonic corruption. Stories about her soon took on the structure of witchcraft tales. She lured the innocent, destroyed purity, and mocked God's creation by trying to reverse aging. For religious leaders, she was the embodiment of sin. For common people, she became a warning of what happened when a woman stepped outside her role. And for politicians, her legend was the perfect justification to strip her family of power. But there is something even more fascinating. Elizabeth's blood rituals mirrored the rising folklore of vampires. In Central and Eastern Europe, villagers believed that blood carried life force. They feared creatures who could drain it, leaving victims pale and lifeless. These beliefs had existed for centuries, but during and after the witch hunts, they grew stronger. By the 18th century, Europe entered a vampire panic. Reports of the dead rising from their graves spread through villages. Officials investigated exhumed corpses, and pamphlets circulated terrifying stories. When writers looked for inspiration, the figure of Elizabeth Báthory, powerful, accused of draining the young, fit the image perfectly. She was not just a murderer. She was recast as an undead predator. This blending of history, witchcraft fears, and vampire folklore ensured that her legend would endure. Even if the truth of her crimes was less dramatic, the timing of her downfall made her the perfect vessel for Europe's darkest fantasies. But the legend did not stay trapped in Hungary or Transylvania. Over time, her story traveled westward into literature, where it inspired Gothic tales that would shape modern horror. From whispers in villages to the pages of novels, the Blood Countess was reborn as something larger than life. Still, one question lingers. What does her story reveal about society itself? Why did Europeans need to believe in a queen who slept in blood? The answer may lie in how people project their deepest fears about women, aging, and power into single individuals. By the time Elizabeth's body was sealed behind the walls of her fortress in 1614, her legend had already escaped those same walls. But it was in the centuries that followed that her story truly transformed, shaped not by witnesses but by writers, poets, and the birth of Gothic literature. The 18th and 19th centuries were obsessed with shadows, ruins, and forbidden desires. In England and France, Gothic novels filled the shelves, thrilling readers with haunted castles, monstrous nobles, and cruel aristocrats who preyed upon the innocent. Elizabeth, though never named directly in many of these works, was there in spirit. The wealthy woman in a ruined fortress, the cruel countess with a thirst for youth. By the 18th century, pamphlets and chronicles of her alleged crimes had spread across Europe. The image of her bathing in blood became fixed. This grotesque ritual made her stand apart from other tales of nobles who killed their servants. Blood was not only shocking, it was symbolic, tied her to witchcraft, vampirism, and forbidden sexuality. In the 19th century, the Gothic revival merged her with the rising fascination for vampires. Bram Stoker's Dracula was not written until 1897, but the soil for that book was already being prepared long before. Writers like Sheridan Le Fanu, who penned Carmilla vampire story about a female predator who preyed upon young girls, drew from legends remarkably close to us. Scholars later noted that Carmilla's traits mirrored the Countess almost exactly: aristocratic, seductive, and eternally youthful through death. Elizabeth's legend also influenced art, theater, and even secret societies fascinated by the occult. For some, she was not just a warning, she was a dark fantasy, a symbol of power beyond morality. Her story blurred the line between horror and desire, between the fear of women's independence and the fascination with forbidden strength. This was the deeper function of her legend. It reflected society's anxieties. In an age when women were expected to remain obedient, the tale of a powerful woman who took life into her own hands in the most twisted ways was both terrifying and intoxicating. She became a mirror for fears about female authority, sexuality, and the threat of aging. Yet, the more her story was retold, the further it drifted from evidence. The bloodbaths may have been a myth invented after her death. The number of her victims may have been inflated by political enemies. But by the time literature adopted her, none of that mattered. Truth was replaced by legend. From crumbling Hungarian castles to candlelit parlors in Victorian London, Elizabeth had become something larger than history. She was no longer just a countess accused of cruelty. She was a Gothic archetype, the eternal Blood Countess. But legends do not stay frozen. Over the next century, she would undergo yet another transformation, this time into modern horror, cinema, and even pop culture. And with every retelling, the question of truth versus myth would grow more difficult to untangle. By the 20th century, Elizabeth's name had become inseparable from the rise of modern horror. As cinema, pulp magazines, and horror novels spread across the world, her story was reborn not as a Hungarian countess accused of crimes, but as the ultimate symbol of female monstrosity and eternal youth. In the early decades, she was invoked in whispers. Silent films and pulp writers hinted at the Blood Countess without always naming her directly. But her defining trait, the bathing in virgin's blood, was too lurid to resist. By the mid-20th century, filmmakers across Europe seized on her myth. The 1971 movie Countess Dracula painted her as a noble woman who murdered servant girls to stay young. Though historically inaccurate, the imagery of a noble bathing in blood was irresistible on screen. Music, too, kept her name alive. Heavy metal bands from the 1980s and 1990s obsessed with shock and darkness invoked her in songs, presenting her as the female counterpart to Vlad Dracula. In the Gothic subculture, she became an icon, a symbol of forbidden beauty and eternal youth, even if born from cruelty. But outside of horror, historians continued to wrestle with her legacy. Was she truly the worst female serial killer in history, or was she a victim of conspiracy? Modern scholars have pointed out how fragile the evidence really is. Testimonies against her came from peasants under torture, or from nobles who gained lands after her imprisonment. And the detail of bathing in blood, it appears only in later retellings, not in the earliest records. Yet popular culture rarely wants doubt. It wants spectacle. That is why even today, Elizabeth is often listed alongside figures like Jack the Ripper, Gilles de Rais, or Vlad the Impaler. Her supposed crimes are repeated as fact, even when historians raise their eyebrows. More than a woman, she has become a canvas. Some storytellers use her as a monster. Others reinterpret her as a misunderstood victim of misogyny and politics. In some films, she is a sorceress, in others a vampire. In every form, she reflects the fears and obsessions of the time: beauty, power, cruelty, and the high price of immortality. What is most striking is how her story bridges the gap between true crime and dark myth. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who remained faceless, Elizabeth was given a role in legend. She was not just a killer, she was a queen of terror, someone whose cruelty was inseparable from her wealth, her gender, and her obsession with age. But there is one final chapter to this dark history: how her tale continues to shape our modern fascination with immortality, beauty, and blood itself. From luxury creams promising eternal youth to the strange experiments of billionaires chasing longevity, Elizabeth's shadow lingers. The story of Elizabeth does not rest quietly in the pages of old chronicles. Instead, it lingers, reshaped with each generation because it touches on something deeper than politics or crime. It strikes at humanity's oldest fear, the unstoppable march of time and the desperate lengths people will go to in order to resist it. Her legend, whether exaggerated or partly invented, reflects an obsession that still defines modern society, the pursuit of eternal youth. Today, we no longer speak of bathing in virgin's blood. Instead, we speak of anti-aging creams, cosmetic surgery, and billionaires funding strange experiments with blood transfusions and longevity science. The tools have changed, but the hunger remains. Elizabeth's story also exposes the dangers of unchecked power. Whether she was guilty of hundreds of murders or the victim of a political conspiracy, the fact remains that no one dared challenge her until it was too late. Her castle became a place where fear reigned, and her wealth placed her above justice at least for a time. In this, she represents the dark side of nobility, when privilege turns into a shield for cruelty. But perhaps the most haunting part of her legacy is how myth can overtake truth. The image of a queen bathing in blood has become so powerful that it is accepted without question, repeated across books, films, and the internet. It no longer matters whether it truly happened. What matters is that people believe it did because it feels true to the fears she represents. Elizabeth has become both a monster and a mirror. For some, she is a symbol of female power twisted into cruelty. For others, she is a victim of male rivals who destroyed her reputation. And for millions more, she is a figure of horror whose name alone conjures images of blood, cruelty, and forbidden beauty. For centuries after her death, her shadow still haunts us. Every retelling, every horror movie, every whispered mention of the Blood Countess is proof that some legends never die. They adapt, they transform, and they continue to fascinate because they echo our deepest desires and darkest fears. Elizabeth may have been buried in silence, her grave unmarked and her body hidden. But her legend refuses to remain in the ground. It rises again and again, like a vampire of history, feeding not on blood, but on our endless curiosity. In the end, the dark truth is this: whether she was a mass murderer, a victim of politics, or something in between, Elizabeth will forever be remembered as the queen who slept in blood to stay young. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all, not eternal youth, but eternal infamy.